A horse surges through the dark, breath smoking in the cold, iron knocking against leather as a rider gathers the reins and lowers a spear. For one suspended instant, it feels as if Europe is about to be changed by a loop of metal no bigger than a hand. That is the legend anyway. History loves a small object with a large consequence. A rider plants his feet, a charge becomes a new kind of violence, and a continent tilts. It is neat. It is memorable. It is almost certainly too simple. Because before the knight became the symbol of medieval Europe, Europe already knew cavalry. Mounted warriors had broken armies centuries earlier. What it did not yet have was a complete mounted order. The war horse, the armor, the saddle, the money, the land, the surplus, the habits of power to sustain all of it. This was a world where harvests could be so thin that seed might return only 2 for 1. A horse was stored food, status, and military force all at once. To keep even one rider mounted and armed demanded more than courage. It demanded acres, labor, and a society organized to feed violence. And in the Frankish world of the 700s, power was still rough and personal. Charles Martel did not begin as a grand architect of Europe, but as the illegitimate son left out of his father's plans, a man who first had to escape imprisonment and fight his way into power. His horsemen mattered, but they were not yet the fully formed male juggernauts of later legend, so the old world still believes war belongs to muscle, harvest, and hierarchy more than to any single device. Then, somewhere between horseflesh, land, and iron, that certainty begins to slip. What if a single foggy night saved a revolution? What if one telegram pulled a nation into war? Yesterday's craziness presents Turning Points, uncovering the tiny forgotten moments that changed everything, and the butterfly effects that shaped our world. And that slip begins not with a single flash of genius, but with a long accumulation of pressures. The Franks were already learning that infantry alone could not answer every frontier raid, every rival lord, every fast-moving incursion out of the south. Horses had to be bred, fed, and equipped. Riders had to be kept ready. Land had to carry military weight. So by the time the stirrup enters the story, Europe is already straining toward a costlier, more mobile kind of war. The metal loop had traveled a long road before anyone tried to make it the hinge of European history. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, the Byzantine world knew the device well enough for the strategikon to give a vivid instruction. On a rescue horse, both stirrups could be placed on the left side, one near the pommel and one near the cantle, so an orderly and a wounded man could mount together. That is not legend. It is battlefield procedure. And it shows the technology spreading through real systems of war long before it became a symbol. Then the Frankish crisis sharpens. Charles Martel spends the 720s and 730s crushing rivals, fighting Saxons and Frisians, and trying to hold together a realm still more stitched than unified. In 725, Muslim raiders pushing north from Spain reach Burgundy and sack Audun. In 732 comes the battle, later wrapped in civilizational myth, Tours, or Poitiers. Charles wins and his reputation hardens, but even here the neat story breaks. Arab accounts describe the Franks fighting on foot, packed tightly to blunt cavalry. The image of the stirrup-locked Frankish knight deciding the fate of Europe starts to dissolve. What Charles actually does matters more. He builds a stronger cavalry arm anyway. Not yet the full shock cavalry of later centuries, but a corps of landed professional fighting men expensive enough to change politics. Britannica is explicit that Frankish horsemen under Charles were not yet using stirrups. To support them, he appropriated ecclesiastical lands, mostly in Burgundy, and redirected their income toward mounted warriors. One telling detail is that this seems to have drawn no contemporary censure. Later, under his sons, the grants were regularized as praecaria. The warrior held the land for life, while the church remained the formal owner. Land was becoming military salary without ceasing to look holy on paper. That is the turning point. Not a rider suddenly discovering balance in iron, but a society crossing the threshold where horse, estate, and armed service begin to lock together. The stirrup belonged to that threshold. It helped riders mount, brace, and stay seated. But the deeper change was organizational. Agricultural surplus made horse warfare less absurdly wasteful. Local power became more militarized. Church property became convertible into cavalry support. The old Frankish order was bent, piece by piece, toward a mounted elite. And then historians tried to compress that long bend into one invention. In 1962, Lynn White Jr. argued that the stirrup had a catalytic effect, helping create the social arrangements later called feudalism. It was a powerful argument because it turned a vast transition into a single, graspable image. But later, historians dismantled it from several angles. Some attacked the chronology. Some pointed out that cavalry had mattered in Europe since Adrianople in 378. Others noted that real shock combat depended on more than foot support, better saddles, stronger girths, breeding, armor, castles, trained riders, and enough grain to feed all of it. One early Byzantine stirrup from Aphrodisias sounds almost too slight for the burden later placed on it, with a footplate only about 10 centimeters wide. Another was found at Karachin Grad, in a building that may even have served as a stable. Small objects, practical objects, moving through practical worlds. So was the stirrup decisive? Yes, if decisive means part of the package that made mounted power scalable. No, if it means one gadget creating the knight or feudal Europe by itself. The stronger explanation is less neat and more unsettling. Technology opened a door. Politics, wealth, and hunger decided who walked through. And once that door opened, Europe did not transform overnight. The years after Martel looked less like a sudden cavalry revolution than a long, hard settling of weight onto land, churches, and local power. Mounted warriors became more necessary, more expensive, and more socially distinct. Estates were asked to feed horses as well as men. Lords who could maintain riders mattered more than men who could only raise a levy. Old public authority kept thinning, and private military power kept thickening in its place. Over time, what had been an adaptation to pressure hardened into expectation. Service tied to land, land tied to protection, protection tied to a mounted elite. The stirrup helped make that world workable. It did not create it alone. But in the generations that followed, Europe kept building in the direction it pointed, until the warrior on horseback was no longer one fighter among many, but the political center of gravity. The frontier raid, the local feud, the castle garrison, the armed retainer, the manor ledger, all of them began to answer to the same logic. And in the long view, that matters far beyond the battlefield. The knight was never just a soldier. He became a social rank, a legal privilege, a moral ideal, a way of organizing wealth itself. Castles, vassalage, heraldry, aristocratic lineage, even the romance of chivalry all grew inside that larger mounted order. Europe's ruling class increasingly learned to imagine itself on horseback. Yet the irony is that the full military package arrived late. By the 12th century, the war saddle had high wraparound pommel and cantle, and was strapped down with a double girth, finally welding horse and rider into the kind of shock system later ages imagined had appeared all at once. And the object kept traveling through culture. A stirrup found in England and dated to 975 to 1075 is not plain kit, but iron decorated with copper alloy inlay, likely linked to renewed Viking attacks at the end of the 10th century. By then, the stirrup was no longer just useful. It was prestigious. A practical device had become part of the visual language of rule, status, and belonging. That may be the real lesson. Turning points are almost never a lone invention dropping into history like a command. More often, they are the moment a society finds a small tool it is ready to build a whole world around. The stirrup did not create feudal Europe by itself. Europe created feudal Europe, and the stirrup fit perfectly into the shape of what it was becoming. If you liked what you watched, please like and subscribe. We post interesting and crazy stories from throughout history every Wednesday and Saturday. Yesterday's craziness? Because yesterday was crazy too.